Hello Blazes, it's your boy Shmuel, and this is the recap video for my special on Judaism in Ethiopia, where I talk about things I left out of the video, correct mistakes that I made in the video, and answer questions from Gaon and Navi level patrons on Patreon. I wanted to keep this separate from the nationalism recap, which will come out tomorrow, just because I wanted to avoid confusion about the Ethiopia video coming in the middle of my nationalism series and emphasize that they are separate, but also that specials like this are a big deal. They tend to be my most popular videos, they take the most work to put together, and they cover a lot of stuff. First of all, I mispronounced the name of the emperor Yeshaq. I said Yeshaq, it should have been Yeshaq. This stood out to people because I guess I try to be pretty accurate with pronunciation, and this just slipped right by me. It's cognate with the Hebrew Yitzchak, obviously, but I tend to do most of my research for this in English, and with my brain in English mode, it didn't register. Now, something I wanted to own up to is my own misunderstanding of genetic studies with relation to Ethiopian Jews, because while there is sizable Levantine ancestry in these studies, it is comparable, or at least within the margin of error, compared to a lot of non-Jewish Ethiopians, and particularly groups like the Tigray and Tigrinya peoples in the north of Ethiopia, and Eritrea. This was my mistake, a full mea culpa. But at the same time, I can't say that this disproves any argument for Jewish continuity in Ethiopia from antiquity. My main source for this video was Stephen Kaplan's The Beta Yisrael in Ethiopia, and as I said in the video, his book both predates human genome sequencing and downplays the significance of a continuous Beta Yisrael bloodline. However, even then, he is quick to defend the continuity of the Beta Yisrael community between antiquity and the early modern period, which even if it involved quite a lot of conversion and intermarriage, still would necessitate a continuous Jewish presence. Now, many people in the comments were complaining that I was overemphasizing this point, and I would guess that most people who felt that way weren't aware of the context of this debate in both historiography and in 20th century Ethiopian politics. The Derg, which was the communist military junta that ruled Ethiopia, very much promoted the idea that Ethiopian Jews were not of Jewish descent. This was part of their campaign to assimilate ethnic and religious minorities, which they saw as a threat to their power. And it's not a coincidence that their rule in Ethiopia was also the apex of the Judaizer hypothesis of Beta Yisrael origins. For those who don't know, Judaizing is what happens when Christian groups begin to adopt more and more Jewish practices and beliefs, and some groups even go so far as to convert to Judaism themselves. We've seen this some in the 19th and 20th centuries in places like India with the Bnei Menashe, and this tends to go along with ideas like the 10 Lost Tribes of Israel, which, as I've explained in some of my very early videos, is mostly ancient Judean propaganda, as the Samaritans are still very much around. The argument for Judaizing in Ethiopia is that the Beta Yisrael were originally Christians who adopted Judaism as a form of rebellion due to internal political struggles in Ethiopian Christianity. The problem with this, as I see it, as do many others, is firstly that Judaizing to the point of conversion is basically unheard of in world history prior to the 19th century, and specifically as a result of Protestant missionaries reaching communities where the historical context of Christianity and Judaism were absent, which in Ethiopia they obviously weren't. And secondly, that the history of the Beta Yisrael in late antiquity is very explicitly tied to other Jewish communities, specifically in Himyar. So I really don't find the Judaizer case compelling. That said, attempting to use DNA evidence the way I did showed a lack of understanding on my part and wasn't strictly necessary to making that point. Something else that was suggested to me was that one of the reasons there was so little Jewish emigration from Ethiopia to Israel under Emperor Haile Selassie was that the law of return, which ensures that anyone can obtain Israeli citizenship provided that they have at least one grandparent who would be considered Jewish under Jewish law, that the law of return didn't apply to Ethiopia during the time of Haile Selassie. Now, I couldn't find any written evidence of this, but there does seem to have been something funny going on here. First up, in 1974, the Jewish Agency for Israel, which is one of the semi-governmental bodies that helps facilitate Jewish immigration, published their conclusion of an internal study that said that the Beta Yisrael weren't Jewish and that the law of return didn't apply to them. However, this caused an immediate public outrage because there were centuries of legal precedent contradicting this in both civil and religious court, and the Jewish Agency immediately had to retract their conclusion. And that backlash suggests that this was not state policy. In fact, President Yeshaq Ben Zvi, all the way back in the 1950s, had been very enthusiastic about Beta Yisrael immigration, and there were Beta Yisrael immigrants in Israel who did acquire citizenship in the 1950s and 60s. So we can only speculate, and I suspect that the early Israeli government, particularly under Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, had some kind of informal agreement with Haile Selassie that Jewish immigration wouldn't be encouraged. Jews had been integral to rebuilding his government during World War II, and Ben-Gurion saw Ethiopia as part of a non-Arab belt of regional partners along with Turkey and Iran, so much like Iran, I suspect that there was political pressure not to encourage emigration. Gaon-level patron Learnabit asks, what are some of the major differences between Haymanot and Rabbinic Judaism? What made outside observers compare it to Karaite Judaism? First up, some viewers in Ethiopia were confused by my use of the term Haymanot, since in Ethio-Semitic languages it just means belief. It's cognate with the Hebrew emunah. And I'd just like to clarify that in a specifically Jewish context, it refers specifically to the formerly Ethiopian stream of Judaism and now the Ethiopian minhag. Some of this I talked about in the video, but maybe not clearly enough. Pre-20th century, those aspects of Haymanot that did retain elements of Rabbinic Judaism, like the duties of a kes or kain, are almost certainly holdovers from antiquity that survived the Ethiopian Dark Age. Where Haymanot differs is primarily in those elements that were reintroduced by those monks sent by Amdaseon I, who restored literacy to the community, and which accordingly lacked their proper Jewish context. So things like making animal sacrifices, not in the temple in Jerusalem, but among the various communities themselves, as well as the incorporation of monks into Judaism, which of course ceased to be viable during the horrific events of the Kifuken, and just steadily died out after that as the monks themselves did, and obviously the very different organization of the Bible. And as I said in the video, most of these don't really exist anymore. Haymanot continues mainly as a cultural tradition on top of Jewish orthodoxy, rather than continuing as a distinct stream of Judaism. And that's the Ethiopia recap video. I know it's a little short, but tune in tomorrow for the recap on the Age of Nationalism, because we've got some spicy takes and even a little mystery.